What is the path to peace for the war in Ukraine? Is America still powerful enough to impose global order? The US has just 4.1% of the world's population, while BRICS countries have 41.5%. In this conversation with economist David Sachs, we discuss the origins of the conflict in Ukraine and NATO enlargement, US-China relations, and the decline of US dominance. David Sachs is the director of the Center for Sustainable Development at Columbia University and president of the UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network. Sachs has been special advisor to 3 United Nations Secretaries General. He was an economic advisor to Gorbachev, Yeltsin, and former president of the Ukraine, Leonid Kuchma. Sachs was twice named among Time magazine's 100 most influential world leaders and received the Tang Prize in Sustainable Development, the Legion of Honor from France, and was co-recipient of the Blue Planet Prize. David Sachs, welcome back to One Planet Podcast and the Creative Process.
Thank you for having me.
So help us understand the history of the war in Ukraine. How did we get here and how do we get out of it? And if the United States isn't the country to help broker that peace, what country is?
This conflict is actually decades in the making. It didn't just come out of a Russian invasion in 2022, as is often said in the Western mainstream media. The war is often defined as an unprovoked attack in 2022. Actually, the roots of this war go back to the end of the Soviet Union and to the geopolitics around that. In 1990, the US and Germany promised the Soviet government at the time, Mikhail Gorbachev, the president, that NATO would not move 1 inch eastward if Gorbachev went ahead and disbanded the Soviet military alliance. In other words, there would be a deal that on the Soviet side, the military alliance, the so-called Warsaw Pact, would be ended, and on the Western side, NATO would not take advantage, and Germany would be reunified, but NATO would not move 1 inch eastward. The U.S. cheated on that because as soon as the Soviet Union ended in 1991, the policymakers in Washington, especially in the Pentagon and in the permanent state in the United States, immediately planned for the eastern expansion of NATO. And by 1992, Ukraine was already on the list that NATO would go that far. In fact, Zbigniew Brzezinski, a U.S. major geostrategist, wrote in 1997 the timeline for NATO expansion, including that Ukraine would become candidate between 2005 and 2010, which is exactly what happened. So this war started, in my opinion, because the United States could not accept a peace in which the military alliances of both sides of the Cold War would stand down. Well, many things happened over the 30 years between the early 1990s and today, but probably the highlights to mention are that in 2008, George W. Bush Jr. pushed NATO, but really pressed that NATO would announce that Ukraine would become a member. And that happened at the Bucharest NATO summit in 2008. The Russian leadership was furious. They had warned again and again, don't do that. We don't want your military right up against our 2,000-kilometer border with Ukraine. Then a Ukrainian president won the election in 2010 on the program of neutrality for Ukraine. Viktor Yanukovych won the election based on the idea that Ukraine doesn't want to become the battlefield between 2 superpowers and called for neutrality, which had been enshrined in the original Ukrainian Declaration of Independence, but then was abandoned by some of the NATO-oriented politicians of Ukraine later on. So in 2010, Yanukovych called for neutrality, but he was overthrown violently in early 2014 with the U.S. participation. So this was really a terrible escalation because the relatively pro-Russian president, but one who called for neutrality, which I think was the only safe course for Ukraine, was overthrown, and the United States played a significant role in that. People know about the famous tape of Victoria Nuland, who is now our Undersecretary of State. At the time, she was the Assistant Secretary of State, and she described who the U.S. would see as the next government 3 weeks before a violent overthrow. It's pretty ugly business, in my opinion. Well, in any event, the war started in February 2014. It escalated between 2014 and 2021. The attempt to end the fighting at the end of 2014 and early 2015 came in two agreements called the Minsk Agreements, in which the government of Ukraine agreed with the breakaway regions of eastern Ukraine that those regions would gain autonomy. And then the government of Ukraine failed to implement the Minsk II agreements, even though they were endorsed by the UN Security Council. So the diplomacy failed again. And when Biden came into office in 2021, rather than trying to de-escalate, he called for NATO enlargement and reinforced the U.S. push to expand eastward. Putin strongly pushed back. Biden pushed back. The U.S. signed several statements in 2021 confirming that NATO would enlarge. I think this was all absolutely irresponsible. Russia massed troops on its border and put on the table a draft U.S.-Russia security agreement on December 17th, 2021, based on no NATO enlargement. The Biden administration formally replied that it was not willing to negotiate over that issue in a response in January. Then Russia invaded on February 24th, 2022, making clear that it was the failure to reach an understanding on the NATO question that was central to Russia's action. 4 weeks later, Zelensky declared that Ukraine was accepting of neutrality. In other words, the initial Russian invasion brought Ukraine to the negotiating table. And during the second half of March, with the Turkish government being the mediators, Russia and Ukraine hammered out a peace agreement. Incredibly, the United States blocked it because the United States told the Ukrainian government, you fight on, because American policymakers had two ideas. One was that Ukraine should not be neutral, it should be a NATO country. And second, that the war would be won by some combination of Western armaments and financial sanctions. And so the U.S. ratcheted up the war. Putin said, no, we don't stand down, we fight, and mobilized hundreds of thousands of Russians in the summer of 2022. And since then, we've been on a path of military escalation. I resent the fact, as a citizen threatened by this, that Biden has not negotiated over NATO and that Biden and Putin have not talked once, as far as we know, since February 24th, 2022. You know, when two sides are fighting, they need to talk and negotiate. But that's rejected. The hardliners in the United States, Nuland, Blinken, Sullivan, Biden, say, why negotiate? We just escalate. We'll defeat Russia. This is, in my view, utterly reckless and irresponsible. First, it leads to the destruction of Ukraine. And second, it risks the escalation to nuclear war. So I'm very unhappy about this, and I very much resent that the mainstream media, like the New York Times, repeats the falsehood all the time that this was an unprovoked action on February 24th, 2022, seemingly wanting us to be without any context or history to understand where this conflict came from and how it can end. And a newspaper like the New York Times has a responsibility to tell the truth, and they're not doing it.
Indeed, as citizens, we have the right, a country is not looking after, in the U.S., the prosperity of its own citizens, going out, conducting these irresponsible wars when we don't have time with other things with the environment. Ironically, what seems to be behind it all is this insistence on a unipolar world, insistence on dominance. And while the U.S. wants to hold on to its status as a reserve currency, it seems under those economic sanctions that U.S. has also suffered, it might even be hastening, strengthening the currencies of other countries.
Well, the basic point is the U.S. has 4.1% of the world population. So how could it presume to be the world leader? You know, the U.S. is a powerful country. It's a rich country, but it doesn't run the world, and it should not aspire to run the world. That's a kind of madness. And the U.S. ideology for a long time has been that the U.S. should run the world. It's, to my mind, unbelievable. But then again, I've spent most of my career outside the U.S. seeing the other 95.9% of the world. And I know that the other 95% of the world doesn't want the United States to run the world. It's not against the United States. It just says, let us have our own part of the world. We don't want you running the world. We don't want you deciding what our government is, who we are, how we rule ourselves. You know, you're just one place. And this, the United States leaders don't understand. They're very arrogant. They're very ignorant because of the two big oceans. They're very unaware of the history of other parts of the world. And we end up with this arrogant and naive and dangerous foreign policy because there's no doubt the United States is rich and powerful, and it makes lots of weapon systems. And I'm 68 years old, and the United States has been at war almost every year of my life, from Vietnam and Laos and Cambodia and Nicaragua and Afghanistan and Iraq and Syria and Libya and now Ukraine. Come on, give it a break. And the U.S. is also experiencing the reality that other places in the world are catching up on technology, indeed leading on technologies as well. And China's a very successful, very industrious, very hardworking society, which in the last 40 years has gone from poverty to a very significant world important economy. And the U.S. has a very hard time accepting that. The U.S. attitude, if you listen to congressmen who don't seem to know anything, is, oh, if China's successful, it must be because they're cheating. What about because they're saving more than 40% of GDP, that the Chinese people have been engaging in a remarkable upgrading of education, hundreds of thousands of PhDs minted each year, massive scientific research programs. Come on, this is the truth. And so this arrogance is not allowing the truth to come through. But you mentioned one specific point, which is the role of the U.S. dollar. Part of the U.S. strength after World War II is, well, the U.S. was basically the only economy standing, and it was a technologically advanced, rich, large economy, the world's largest. And the dollar was really the only internationally usable currency for quite a long time. So the dollar system became the center of how you do international trade. When you trade in goods, they're denominated in dollars. When you buy the imports, you pay in dollars, meaning you use accounts in U.S. dollars, typically in the U.S. banking system. When the transaction is closed, it's closed through the so-called SWIFT interbank system. And so the U.S. has had what France long ago called an exorbitant privilege, that it could print a lot of money because the rest of the world was holding dollars, using dollars. The dollar was the basis of the world economy. That's changing now. And it's changing for three basic reasons. One is the share of the U.S. in the world economy is diminishing. So this means that the predominance of the U.S. is bound to diminish. The second is technologically, settlements are going to occur in all sorts of ways other than through U.S. banks. And so-called digital currencies, especially central bank digital currencies, will mean other ways to make settlements. We'll settle in renminbi when we buy in China, or settle in rubles, or settle in rupees when trade is with India, and so forth. So there will be multiple currencies. And then the third part, which is really a matter of a bad set of decision making, the U.S. has militarized the dollar, meaning that usually you think about money, well, you have it, you can use it, you can spend it. But the United States has come to say, if we don't like you, you don't necessarily have access to your money anymore if it's in our banks. So the U.S. froze the dollar holdings of Russia. The U.S. has frozen the dollar holdings of Venezuela. The U.S. froze the dollar holdings of Afghanistan. My advice to any government government that's not getting along with the U.S. government is be careful about your money because the U.S. might come in and freeze your money. And so countries are looking to hold their reserves in other ways now. Perfectly understandable. And I think that this is another part of the move to a multi-currency international system from a dollar-based international system.
And you mentioned the possibility of a reserve currency being the renminbi. And so there's other things that are not often reported about China. One, and I know that you've written about this as well, is that they're stepping in where America's policy of destabilizing and it's destructive. China, in some cases in the Middle East, is stepping in as a peacemaker, and it's less expensive if we can achieve peace.
Well, probably the most remarkable diplomatic achievement of recent years, I would say, is China brokering a peace agreement between Saudi Arabia and Iran. In the American idea, those two countries were implacable foes. They could never agree. And for the United States, Iran was the enemy and Saudi Arabia was the ally. But the whole idea of U.S. foreign policy is you bring countries under your authority as an ally of the United States, like Saudi Arabia, and you fight your enemies on the other side. But China has a different idea, which is that Saudi Arabia and Iran had no fundamental reasons for this dissension, but they have plenty of reasons for cooperation. For one thing, they're both being hard hit by climate change. They need to cooperate because the water crisis is quite severe. They're both hydrocarbon economies. They need an energy transformation, which is very profound. And so the Chinese facilitated a reconciliation between the two. I'm very happy about that reconciliation, by the way. The fighting between, the bitterness between Iran and Saudi Arabia divided Western Asia. It contributed to an absolutely devastating war in Yemen, in which the United States gave its military support that killed a lot of people. And it destabilized a region that needs a lot of economic transformation and technological upgrading and change. And so this agreement is really a big help for the whole region, not only for the two countries involved. And China gets a lot of credit, in my view, for having the wisdom to see that that was a conflict that could be solved, not just exacerbated. But the U.S. approach was always to push at it. Even when the U.S. made an agreement with Iran, the nuclear agreement called the JCPOA, the U.S. government walked away from it. And then it maintained sanctions on Iran because the U.S. is not really serious at making peace most of the time. It's got an us versus them mentality. And I find that very destructive and not in the U.S. interest.
Yes, and I hope that China maintains this sensible approach because it's dangerous what's happening now in Taiwan. And just help us understand the situation, like in that through line between these proxy wars and what could happen in China.
Well, the situation in Taiwan is like the situation in Ukraine, very explosive, very dangerous, and requires cool heads to avoid a conflict. The fact of the matter is that actually all three governments, let me say, the United States, Taiwan, and China, have a policy that there's one China. And whether it is the government in Taiwan or the government in Beijing, they both say there's one China. They disagree on what happened in 1949 and how China should be governed, but they don't say there are two countries. And the United States, when it established diplomatic relations with the People's Republic of China, very clearly said that there is one China and has one China policy. And that is how to keep peace and to make sure that this tension between Beijing and Taipei does not boil over to open conflict. But the United States started to play games with this. It started to form a military alliance with Taiwan, in effect, which is really coming into a military alliance in the middle of one country. And this is an extremely dangerous and imprudent thing to do. And Biden starts talking about how we're going to defend Taiwan, and the American politicians talk about how a war is coming. It's all utterly reckless, irresponsible. And what we should have is trying to reduce tensions, diffuse tensions through negotiation, through talk, through peace-building ideas, rather than stoking the idea that some conflict is inevitable. A conflict would be devastating, of course, first and foremost for Taiwan, but actually for the whole world. And so this needs to be avoided, and we need cool heads, and we shouldn't have American politicians saber-rattling. We should not have Speaker Nancy Pelosi fly to Taiwan after the Chinese government has repeatedly said, don't do that, don't provoke, don't stir up things. Don't make conflicts where there don't have to be conflicts. But the United States leadership doesn't listen very well. It's the same thing that when Putin said many times, do not expand NATO to Ukraine. The United States, oh, sorry, we don't hear you. You have nothing to say about that. That's none of your business. And then war comes. This is very typical of American foreign policy because American foreign policy leaders are too arrogant and they don't listen.
Yes. And now 61 years since the Cuban Missile Crisis, you'd think we learned our lesson. And of course, America would never accept a military alliance on its doorstep, say coming down from Canada or something like that.
Well, of course, when Cuba aligned with the Soviet Union in 1960, the U.S. idea was invade. That's it. It didn't say, oh, Mr. Castro, you can do what you want. It's an open door. If you want to be with Soviet Union, that's fine with us. No, it said, well, we invade. So that was 1961. In 1962, in the repercussions of that and in a really reckless gamble and reckless action by the Soviet Union putting missiles into Cuba, this whole conflict escalated to just the brink of nuclear war in the Cuban Missile Crisis. And then in 1963, both President Kennedy and Soviet Chairman Nikita Khrushchev said, we have to pull back from the brink. We have to live together. We should not be coming to the edge of global nuclear war. And they signed the Partial Nuclear Test Ban Treaty in the summer of 1963, proving that even at the height of the Cold War, if the mindset is right, you can make peace. And that's the mindset that we need now.
Yes, it seems like the neocon mindset never really went away. Just help us understand, because to my mind, Ukraine is not indispensable for the U.S., right? It's just this idea of NATO enlargement. But there's other forces behind the scenes that are, profiting or pushing. And I understand that Zelensky, secured $110 billion in U.S. aid and, of course, humanitarian, financial, military support. Also, like key partnerships with, the BlackRock venture capital firm, Goldman Sachs, to privatize Ukrainian assets. So that would then deepen the country's debt. So help us understand that a little, the path forward. How do we get out of this?
Well, when the debate raged initially in the 1990s about the wisdom or lack of wisdom of NATO enlargement, which was contrary to what we had promised and was not wise, a lobbying campaign took place in the United States led by the military-industrial complex. Very crude. That's how American politics works. Bring out the big bucks. So it was Raytheon and Lockheed Martin and other big companies became the lobbyists. And then, American congressmen, they salute money. They salute campaign contributions. They salute the lobbyists. And so this is how American politics works. There are always financial interests that are also playing a role here. So we have a mix of ideology, confusion, lack of historical sense, arrogance, and money all stirring the pot. It has very little to do with the American people, though. The American people are not asked about anything. The votes on money for Ukraine are generally almost secret because they're not really debated. They're just measures stuck into some other piece of legislation so that you never have to debate the fact that we've spent more than $110 billion so far on Ukraine, and nobody's really been asked about it. Nothing of the American people haven't really been asked. So this is how American politics works. Now, what should be done? This war should end by the United States saying that NATO will not enlarge and Russia saying we take our troops home. That's the core of this. That was available in December 2021. It was available in March 2022, and it's still available now. It doesn't solve many other issues. What happens to the territories? What happens to Crimea? These are for negotiations, but the basic idea is that the two superpowers back off and that the war stops and that we go to political solutions, not military solutions. And that should be our priority.
And so finally, as you think about the future, the prospect of nuclear war, the kind of world that we're leaving the next generation, what would you like young people to know, preserve, and remember?
Young people should lead the way to a safer, cooperative, peaceful, and environmentally sustainable and fair world. This is the point. We need to build the future we want, not to feel trapped in this mindless cycle of violence and environmental destruction. The problems that we face are solvable, and they are not driven by the needs of the people. They're driven by greed or power seeking of elites. And we need to have a new generation say, this is not working. We want a world that is at peace, that is shared in prosperity, and that solves the environmental crises, which have become so deep and are neglected in part because we are wasting our time, our lives, our resources on these useless wars.
Maybe a good place for me to start to discuss the issue of U.S.-China relations is with the book of a good friend of mine, someone very well known in our country, who's very clever, and I fundamentally hope he's wrong, but he keeps on being right about things, and that's John Mearsheimer. And many of you follow Professor Mearsheimer at University of Chicago. And he wrote a very good book that, again, I really disagree with, but it's a great book. In 2001, The Tragedy of Great Power Politics. And as our super realist in international relations, John sees great power politics as being filled with confrontation and frictions, and basically a kind of struggle for survival, and very much a zero-sum world in which the gains of one side are the losses of the other in this power struggle. And as an economist, I see the world very differently, because the actual basic idea that goes back to Adam Smith is that an interconnected economy is a win-win proposition, that economics is not zero-sum but positive-sum, that there are gains from cooperation, gains from the division of labor, gains from specialization, gains from a large market that creates an acceleration of innovation, and gains from the fun of being in a world in which you can taste other people's food, enjoy their culture, listen to their music, travel to their societies, and benefit from cultural diversity. Well, I go back to John Mearsheimer because in his book, The Tragedy of Great Power Politics, he writes that at the time of that book, it's either 2001 or 2002, I don't remember exactly, he says, great power politics is quiet right now, but we will get back to confrontation. So give him a check mark. And he said, we'll have confrontation between the US and China, because China's going to rise, China's going to become a much more powerful country, and that will lead to confrontation. And I read that and I thought, no, it's good if China rises, that's good. Win-win. Gains. We want China to end poverty, to overcome the 100 years of humiliation, so-called, the great difficulties of the 19th century, indeed, up to really the start of the rapid economic growth in 1978. And that will be good. Why should there be controversy? Why should there be conflict? And John was right and I was wrong, because there is confrontation and there's conflict. I'm more right than he is, though, not in prediction, but in saying there's no reason for this conflict. This is not some fundamental struggle of survival. This is not some fundamental confrontation of two systems. This is not what Biden absurdly said upon taking office, that the great struggle of our age is democracy versus autocracy. None of this. This is what Mearsheimer said. China is rich and powerful. The United States is rich and powerful. Great powers have controversy over nothing more than the fact that they're each rich and powerful. That's a dumb reason for controversy, by the way. An even worse reason to blow up the world or to talk about war as our politicians do. And my view is that we are being exposed to the unbelievable foolishness of our politicians every day. Hotheads who have not had the benefit of being at the Chinese Institute, know nothing, know no history, have no context, are ignorant, should get a passport, should go for a trip, should enjoy a holiday, and come back, calm down. But they don't. So Mearsheimer was right. We are in a really dangerous situation with China, but I'm also right. I can't see any single underlying reason for it that is a serious reason for confrontation. In economics, there's no such thing as China's gains being our losses. China is not a threat to the US economy. China is not a threat to US prosperity. China is not a threat to the US political system. We are the threat to the US political system. So there's nothing that has happened that gives me any worry about China. What gives me worry is about the structure of how the two countries are relating. So the second influential piece that I would refer to understand this is a remarkable essay, terrible in my view, by a former colleague of mine when we were at Harvard together, Robert Blackwell, well known, one of our leading diplomats. And he wrote a piece for the Council on Foreign Relations in, I think, 2016. It may be 2015. But it was about US grand strategy and China. It's really worth reading. Fascinating. Again, highly predictive, but terrible in my view, to put it bluntly. And I am blunt, so I want you to understand my point of view. So what Ambassador Blackwell wrote in 2015 or 2016 with Ashley Hellis, his co-author, is that, and it's there vividly, so it will really help if you haven't read it to understand the weirdness of what's going on. He wrote that America's grand strategy from the beginning of our country has been hegemony. First it was hegemony over the eastern seaboard, then it was hegemony over North America, then it was hegemony over the Americas, then it was the idea of global hegemony, that the US should be the dominant power in every region of the world and not brook even competition in any other region of a regional hegemon, so-called. These are all concepts of international relations. They don't make too much sense to me, frankly, in economics, but in any event, this is how our strategists think about things. So he wrote that that is our strategy, to be dominant. And China is a threat to that strategy. That is absolutely true. If your strategy is to be dominant, well, China's a big threat to that. Because how can you be dominant if there's a very successful country that happens to be 4 times larger in population, is doing very well, thank you, turns out hundreds of thousands of incredibly skilled PhDs in the sciences and technology. What is this dominance? How about being productive? How about being peaceful? How about having a nice life? How about having universal health coverage or other decent things which we might have in this country if we actually thought about it? But dominance, no. Then China's a threat, if that's your definition, which is mind-boggling to me, because suppose the whole world had the idea that the only goal is to be dominant. Well, if that is the way, then John Mearsheimer's right. It's all a tragedy, because not everybody can be dominant. And if that's your view, I suggest you go first to a psychologist, psychiatrist, or a good counselor, or a good friend who could help calm you down and tell you about the good things in life, but not the importance of being dominant, because that really does create a problem if that were generalized. You could think about it in a Kantian way. That does not work as a categorical imperative if everybody is aiming for dominance. So, in this essay of Blackwell, our grand strategy is to be dominant. And so he writes very clearly, China's rise is no longer in America's interest. That's pretty weird. Now, we should understand a couple of basic things. China is roughly the same size as the US economy right now in aggregate. Depends how you measure things. There are always two ways to measure things. One is at the prices of each country's own markets, and then you convert the yuan output to dollar output with the market exchange rate, and that's called market prices. And the other is a common set of prices that you apply to the goods and services of each country. That's called purchasing power parity adjusted prices. And by the market prices, China's economy in the aggregate is something like 3/4 of the size of the US in dollar terms. China's 4 times larger. So that would mean 3/4 times 1/4, or 3/16 the size, or roughly in per capita terms, 20% of the US economy in total size, 3/4. If you look at it at international prices or purchasing power adjusted prices, China's a bigger economy. And the IMF gives us data all the time in what is called the World Economic Outlook. You can go to imf.org and just look at the data, which I do 10 times a day for my job. And if you look at the purchasing power adjusted prices, China is about 30% larger than the United States in absolute size. So 1.3 divided by 4, because the population is 4 times larger. So in per person terms, about 30% or 35% of the US. China's poorer per capita than the United States, but it's a big economy, because 1.4 billion people is a lot more than 335 million people, which is the US population. Now, that's freaking out the policymakers in the US. They're bigger. How dare they be bigger? But it's kind of arithmetic. The only way that China could be smaller than the US is to stay at a per capita income less than 1/4 of America. But why should they? Because China's filled with clever people, with good entrepreneurs, with technology. Technology flows in this world. It always has, and it will continue to. And China now is absolutely in the front ranks of scientific breakthroughs and of technological innovation, arguably ahead in many, many sectors, comparable in many and behind in some, but a superpower in science and technology, and with superb universities and all of the things that make for a high-income country. And why not? China was the world leader for 1,000 years at least. It lost that lead by a terrible policy error in the year 1434, when the Ming court stopped the great fleet of Admiral Zheng He, and China went protectionist, and the next time it was really deeply exposed to the world is when British steamers were coming up the river to bomb the Qing imperial properties in the First Opium War. So China is going to be successful, and it's not going to stay at less than a quarter of US per capita income. It's going to continue to grow. And incidentally, you read these days op-eds, oh, China's miracle's over, China's finished, the Chinese economy is collapsing. This is so ignorant, I can't even tell you. China, by the way, will have business cycles like the United States does. It will have financial booms and busts. Nobody has figured out how to avoid financial crises in the last 300 years of market economy. So China no doubt has too much debt in some cities and in some real estate enterprises, no doubt. But China's going to continue to grow, and it's going to continue to narrow the gap with the United States in per capita terms. It's going to be bigger than the United States in absolute terms. It already is by one good measure, and it will be by the other good measure without doubt, unless there's global calamity of some sort, which I'm putting aside for the moment. And so the whole idea of American grand strategy is really messed up. And that is one large part of our problem right now. What Blackwell and Tellis recommended in this essay in 2015 or 2016, and when you read something on the Council on Foreign Relations, usually what's written is already policy, so it's letting the public know what the thinking in Washington is. It's not really even a trial balloon, it's already what's established. Blackwell says that China's rise is no longer in America's interest, and then there's a list of things that should be done. We should use trade policy to stop China's export growth. We should restrict the flow of technology to China. We should bolster our military alliances along the Pacific Rim countries. We should form trade groups in Asia that don't include China. One of the weirdest ideas imaginable, by the way. If they would ever look at a map, they would see that this is not really the most sensible idea in the world. But grown-ups in Washington, they're physically grown-ups. They actually did this. This was the whole idea of the TPP. Stupider, I can't imagine. But we have grown-ups that say, let's have a trade agreement in Asia where China's the lead trade partner of every one of the countries, and clever us, we won't include China. Okay, this is what passes for public policy. So Blackwell listed all the things that we should do, and we're doing all of them. First, in the instability of the Trump period, where there's a lot of noise to signal, so you never knew day to day what was really going on, nor did anyone else, including the president. But he started this process of unilateral trade measures and barking at China and generally trying to raise tensions. And then Biden came in And I thought there would be some more grown-up behavior, as I said, and actually it got worse because it became more systematic, more systematically wrong. So what Biden did is just going through the list that Blackwell set out in 2016 or 2015, which is all the measures one takes of containment. And this is, one should understand, this is the third round of American policy in this regard. It was invented for the Soviet Union, and it was deployed in the 1950s vis-a-vis the Soviet Union. And then, interestingly, it was deployed in a lighter way against Japan at the end of the 1980s and early 1990s, because Japan became so successful that even though Japan was our ally and has no army and everything else, Japan basically became an enemy in economic terms, and the United States landed very heavily on Japan and said, you can't export anymore to us, and you have to agree to that, you have to overvalue your currency by 50%, and you have to do all sorts of things because we're not going to let you continue to have the success. And we stopped Japanese growth. So this is the third try of this. But China's not Japan. Japan is 125 million people, and China's 1.4 billion people, and Japan is under the US security umbrella, and China is an independent superpower, and it's not going to sit still the way that Japan did in the early 1990s. China's going to figure out its way around all of this. But that was a big part of what we're seeing right now. So in a deep sense, Mearsheimer was right. China did nothing special to provoke any of this other than achieving rapid economic growth and economic progress. I see nothing extraordinary, of course. Every claim of China's success is they stole it from us, they cheated. This is both fantasy and prejudice mixed together with the fact that everybody steals a bit from everybody else, so there was nothing special about what China did. But in any event, it is the playbook, contain China, and that's a big part of what's going on. There's one other part of what's happening in our relationship, which is more economic, but also playing a role. And that is that when China achieved its economic success, heavily based on export-led growth, and heavily based on export-led growth to the US market, just as Adam Smith said, this made the US richer, it made China richer, it was a win-win proposition, the strong interrelations of China and the United States. But what you learn from trade history and trade theory, both, is that a win-win proposition at the aggregate level, that the US became a richer economy because China was becoming a richer economy, also went alongside inequalities within the United States, some of which arose from trade itself. So in international trade, there are losers as well as winners. The most basic theorem of international trade, going back to Smith and David Ricardo and Paul Samuelson in the 20th century, is that the winners win more than the losers lose, so that the overall size of the economy grows. And for everybody to win from trade, the winners should compensate the losers. So the idea is a growing economy, which the US has had, should be enough for everybody to rise in that economy. But instead, there are pockets in our, not just pockets in our society, significant parts of our society that are not rising, they're falling. So the US has become very rich, and the rich part of the United States has become really rich. And there are two parts of our society that are hurting. One is specifically places that are in the import competition with China, and that is the Midwest to an important extent. And those happen to be swing states in presidential elections. So Wisconsin, Minnesota, Ohio, my home state of Michigan, Indiana, Pennsylvania, and so forth. A lot of places there were hit by very high quality, low cost Chinese manufactured exports. And the second part of our society that's been hit in general is people with educational attainment of high school or less, because our society's absolutely diverged between university education and high school education on every dimension of well-being, including life expectancy, including health, including income levels, and so on. Now, in international trade theory and practice, the winners should help the losers. But we're a kind of nasty society. I think I would like to make that clear. Our political system was invented in the British mode of John Locke. John Locke, the philosopher at the end of the 17th century. And John Locke's idea was that you own your own labor and nobody should take it away from you. And that is pretty deeply embedded in the American psyche, which is, that's mine, thank you. And I don't want to be taxed. And we are a low-tax society that complains endlessly about taxes. That's the American tradition. In fact, there would be no United States of America other than for a tax revolt. The British wanted to put a little bit of tax on the Americans to help pay for the post-1763 costs after the 7 Years' War, and the colonists said, hell no, we don't have to pay any taxes, and no taxes without representation, and by the way, no taxes with representation is the American way as well, because our Congress is bought off by rich people who tell them, don't you dare ever charge us more taxes. That's how the American political system works. So, simply, the winners don't like to compensate the losers in the United States. In fact, they like to say, you're losers. And so Trump ran on this basis instead of running on what a nice party in Europe would run on, a social democratic platform that says, you know, we're all one society and we're awfully rich, and we should make sure that even if you lose your job, you have health care, and college education is too expensive, so we'll make sure that it's affordable. That's what a nice place would do. What Trump ran on was something completely different. He ran on tax cuts for the rich, and China is the one causing you all this. You see? Thank you, Donald. China's the one causing you all this pain. They stole your jobs. And I'm never going to let them get away with that. And so intersecting with our grand strategy, which is ridiculous, is the protectionism that comes from a society in which winners don't compensate losers, but winners deflect the blame by blaming foreigners. And Trump's whole campaign was, you can blame everyone else except rich people. Rich people we give tax cuts to, but blame the people coming up from the border from Mexico, or blame the Chinese, or blame the foreigners. That plays well. It makes a nasty society even nastier and more disorganized and disoriented, and he did a very good job of that. And the Democrats, what used to be my party before I decisively left it, I have no home politically. I'm just disgusted by all of it. The Democrats learned the lesson of 2016, which is, protectionism is the way to win power. So the Democrats are always learning from the Republicans. They learned from the Republicans in the 1980s, always advocate for tax cuts. That's how Reagan became so popular. And then the Democrat, and remember, well, you don't remember, but if you're as old as I am, you remember Walter Mondale said, he's going to raise taxes, I'm going to raise taxes, he's going to raise taxes too, he just won't tell you. And Mondale lost 49 states by saying that. And since then, no Democrat has said, we'll raise taxes. They just follow the Republicans. Then it used to be that the Republicans were free traders, and then Trump cleverly exploited the widening inequalities in the United States and turned it into an anti-China protectionism. And then the Democrats have learned that too. So, and then we have our grand strategist of our day, Jake Sullivan, who put the two pieces together and said, we can be protectionist and use this to contain China and win elections, and he's made a huge mess of everything by basically advising and helping to guide a policy where Biden came in and decided to double down on the anti-China sentiment and the anti-China policies. So in the first year of the administration, where I had a lot of former friends, they're not my friends anymore, I mean, I like them still, they don't like me anymore. But anyway, I said, now reach out to your counterparts. We know all the technocrats in China, all the economic technocrats, of course, because we trained a lot of them. They're our students. They're our friends for 30 years or 40 years. They said, no, the White House has said no contact. You can't have contact. We're reviewing our China policy. So for the first year, there was no discussion, basically. Even at the technocratic level, it was amazing. So wrong-headed, by the way. As an academic, I could keep all the contacts, talk to people, see friends, visit Beijing before COVID hit, and at least keep open channels, but the administration, no open channels at all. And then the idea was the tension must be good for our politics. We'll show how tough we are, we'll continue containment, we'll be more protectionist, we'll have a build in America policy, which is what Biden is trying to do with the Infrastructure Act and the Inflation Reduction Act and so forth. And that is how things went, basically until about 6 months ago. I would add in Nancy Pelosi's absolutely absurd and reckless trip to Taipei. You just can't imagine more irresponsibility than that, in my opinion. And she is enormously irresponsible and just playing for the home crowd. But she went, and so Taiwan is added to this, and President Tsai in Taiwan has also been, in my opinion, irresponsible by rhetoric that is very loose, very dangerous, and in the midst of all of these other tensions, just raising the stakes in a way that allow our worst hotheads, and if you want our very worst hothead, it's Lindsey Graham, dumber you cannot get, and more militaristic you cannot get. He wants war everywhere. This week it's with Iran, but before that it was with China, before that it was with Russia. So this is really our state of affairs, that the protectionism, the grand strategy, the irresponsibility of Washington politicians, I think created all of this. I can't see. China made one mistake, by the way, rhetorically, and that was in 2014 when China launched the Made in China 2025 policy, which is a very smart policy calling for China to become leader in technology in 10 major areas. China said not that we want to advance in these areas. China said we want to dominate in these areas. We want to lead in these areas. That was not a good idea. It would have been much smarter to say we want to advance in these areas. We could have saved a lot of grief by a different kind of rhetoric. So this is my basic interpretation of where we are right now. I said that it came to about 6 months ago when things were really boiling. I mean, very dangerous. The balloon incident, the war in Ukraine going not the way that the United States wanted or expected, another debacle of U.S. foreign policy, terrible debacle, because that's a war that never should have happened, and it was a war caused by this relentless idea of NATO enlargement to Ukraine, which is, talk about red lines. It's like Taiwan, but from Russia's point of view. You don't put the U.S. military on the Ukraine-Russia border, and they couldn't figure that out because they're not very clever at thinking through the eyes of the other side. So 6 months ago, things were really getting out of hand, and here we are. I think they decided about 6 months ago, this is not good. We need to start dialing back. And so that's why several of our cabinet secretaries went to China, why the rhetoric was toned down. Still, they can't quite calibrate this because even when, say, Janet Yellen went, and she was saying we want good relations, Biden was at the same time signing another unilateral executive order to tighten the restrictions on technology exports to China. So we can't so far sustain quiet and calm. But I think the intention right now is with an overloaded U.S. foreign policy, a failing war in Ukraine, a disaster in the Middle East, a president that's very unpopular, running against a probable convicted felon. It's a great scene. They want not so much tension in the next 12 months, and I think that that is the goal right now. And since there's no deep reason for this conflict, other than the ones that I've described, it would not be hard to dial back the tensions. It's not as if we are at dire loggerheads over anything real. We are in a constructed confrontation out of mindsets, not out of direct clash of interests. So finally, I am late and have to go and am hogging the mic. China will have its ups and downs, but the main direction is not like that. The main direction is up. The most basic thing to watch is education, technology, and innovation. And on that, China's in the first ranks. And for an economy at China's level of development, that's the key. And that's not going away. That's going to continue. And China is leader, rightly, in many important technologies for the next 30 years. In digital technologies, in electric vehicles, in renewable energy, and many, many things. And the US might try to might continue to try to contain China, but it can't do it. Even the technology cutoffs will not have much effect at all. China's busy innovating around the microchips, and I would not worry too much about that. And if the U.S. blocks the U.S. market for China's goods, there's a whole world outside of the U.S. that wants Chinese goods, and that's what the Belt and Road Initiative and other similar initiatives of China, like the BRICS expansion, are after. So all in all, China will continue to develop. We should view that absolutely positively. It means better lives for the Chinese people. It means better opportunities for the world economy. It's better for the United States. China's progress is plus for the United States, and we should try to help our politicians make sense. Thank you very much.
Would you agree that China is using this Hamiltonian approach to economics, perhaps coming from Sun Yat-sen, whose influence who is highly influenced by Hamilton?
Well, China has what I would simply call a mixed economy, which means it's partly state-directed, partly market-directed. I think all successful economies are mixed economies. And the U.S., even when it uses free market rhetoric, of course, has a large role of the government, not necessarily accurate role, but a large role of government in the economy. Different countries come down differently on how they carve up the relative weights and responsibilities of public, private, and civil society sectors. It's true that the UK, US approach is relatively more on the laissez-faire side. I'd say relatively more. We're lower taxes, certainly as a share of national income, a much lower social outlays. The UK more than the United States, even though it started with laissez-faire in the 19th century. The UK adopted a national health service, of course, after World War II. The United States never did that. China's a very pragmatic and economically well-governed country. Very impressive during the past 40 years because they've had a planning model with a major role of state finance combined with a very dynamic and competitive market sector and a very entrepreneurial lead in many sectors as well. I was just in China and noted a huge rise of electric vehicles, and there are hundreds of electric vehicle companies right now, startups. It's expected that the number will whittle down quickly to perhaps between 5 and 10 such companies, but right now it's named to be in the hundreds of companies producing electric vehicles, and it's a fiercely competitive market inside China. Now, when it comes to the international side, China's just doing a lot of things that the United States did for a while after World War II, which was help finance infrastructure abroad, make the way for U.S. multinational companies, in fact. And China right now is doing that. The United States doesn't do much internationally at all other than war, but it doesn't do peaceful economic development activities. And you can see in the rhetoric of American leaders, politicians, their resentment that China dares to help other countries to build infrastructure. You know, the Belt and Road Initiative, which is a very valid and quite beneficial win-win program of China, together with more than 150 other countries, by the way, is badmouthed every day by the United States, mainly out of resentment and jealousy, because the U.S. doesn't have that kind of spirit to make connections with other countries, and China is making massive investments and working with other countries to help them with developing an electric power grid, basic renewable energy sources, fast rail, 5G technologies, paved roads and highways, and many other desirable things that those counterpart countries really need. Now Biden is talking about a road project from India to the Mideast. And he's so proud of this one road. It doesn't exist. It's not financed. It's it may be a good idea, but it's a little pathetic, actually, to tell you the truth, because China has dozens of projects like this all over the world. The United States has thought about one. Literally, I guess they took the one belt, one road idea, but they took one road. There's one corridor that they're talking about, whereas China is doing dozens of these projects. So the U.S. is kind of looking on.
I think that IMEC program is dead with the war now.
Yes, I think that's right. And we're so paralyzed, so ineffective, so paralyzed with everything, so war-driven, that an idea of a road becomes about the best that we can do, and a road that perhaps never will be built.
Right. Okay, well, look, I'll come back to China, but I also knew that you were at the Valdai discussion club. And I was told, actually, by Richard Sakwa, whom I interviewed yesterday, whom you know, he was also speaking at Valdai, but he told me that you were speaking there on the question of the discussion for a new currency and a new international trade mechanism that's taking place within the BRICS. I think you know that Sergei Glaziev, who has been a key economist in formulating these ideas, working with China and the other BRICS countries, and now really the whole global South, working on putting together this kind of idea. And you probably know that Lyndon LaRouche, that Glaziev has openly praised Lyndon LaRouche's economic ideas, and especially the article he wrote in the year 2000, which was called "Toward a Basket of Hard Commodities, Trade Without Currency." So perhaps you can say a bit about where you think that whole plan stands today. I was not able to find the video of your presentation at Valdai, so I'm counting on you to fill us in.
Basically, I noted that having one dominant currency in the world, which has been the U.S. dollar after World War II, and which was the pound sterling before World War I, has certain advantages because money is just a means of settling transactions for the real economy, for the non-monetary economy. So having a single currency can be efficient, but the U.S. Has blown it by weaponizing the dollar. The U.S. Had an advantage because other countries and international businesses use the dollar, and that does give benefits to the U.S., so-called seniorage benefits and other benefits, but essentially the ease of borrowing abroad and very high liquidity of your own national currency. But the U.S. started to weaponize the dollar, meaning rather than letting it be used just for transactions purposes, the United States used this special situation of having transactions pass through the dollar banking system and ultimately through the central bank of the U.S., the Federal Reserve, to start confiscating the dollars of other countries that the U.S. disagreed with in foreign policy. This is really obnoxious behavior, by the way, because the idea of money is, again, as a transactions medium, not as a hostage to foreign policy. And because the dollar was so dominant, even after the U.S. confiscated reserves of Iran or North Korea, then Venezuela, now Russia, many countries use the dollar, but they don't like to use it because they're a little afraid of saying a word that's cross to the U.S. and then seeing the U.S. government come down on them, even freezing their money. It's pretty bad behavior, in my view, but basically very ill-advised, because the BRICS countries now, and it started with the original five, with Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, but now it's going to include the new six, which is Argentina, Egypt, Ethiopia, Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, and Iran. This is a big group of countries, and they're saying, we don't want to use the dollar because, frankly, we don't want our money confiscated. And so they're going to develop an alternative payments system. They will be successful at that because it's not so hard to make payments in other ways, in renminbi or in rubles or rupees or in an R5 currency, so-called, because the original BRICS 5 all have an R currency. The real, the ruble, the rupee, the renminbi, and the rand. So they call it the R5, and they may just make a basket using those five currencies for denomination and even for lending and borrowing in a bond denominated in a basket of currencies. So I expect something interesting and good to come out of this. Again, it's a little bit regrettable in a way if having a single medium of exchange, it wouldn't even have to be one country. Keynes had the idea that it would be the IMF's currency, the Bancor, he called it in a famous writing, would have certain convenience. But if it's then used monopolistically for militarized or foreign policy or geopolitical purposes, it's not going to last long, because there are always workarounds when it comes to trade and to financial settlements. And that's what the BRICS are doing right now. They're going to do a workaround.
I sent you, just before we got on this call, a article that was published by Glaziev, I think just today, or at least recently, on this, in which he emphasizes that while the basket of currencies and the R5, these are definitely being implemented already in various forms, but that eventually the idea of a separate currency, maybe the R5, but some separate currency which would be also tied to a basket of commodities rather than just currencies, to, in a certain sense, tie it to the cost, the actual cost of production of the real economy. And that in general, he thinks this is something that it's basically simple to finish completing it, that he's hopeful that it can be done by next year when Russia is head of the BRICS and will be holding the BRICS conference in Kazan, I believe. So anyway, I'd be interested in your response to his article.
I haven't read it yet. Let me just say that there are several different issues involved in our discussion. One is the privilege of the U.S. to host the international currency, and I've explained why the U.S. has misused that privilege and why it's now going to lose a lot of the business, so-called, of settlements in dollars. But a second is the mechanics of payment systems. And the third is the management of monetary policy. These are all distinct issues. On the payments mechanisms, we can do something that could never have been done before, and that is digital settlements. So we don't even need a banking system now, and we don't need cash in circulation or gold bars and other or gold coins and other mechanisms that were mechanisms of settlement, because now digitally every transaction can be tracked. We know there are different ways to do it. Blockchain is one, but there are many other probably more efficient ways to do it with central bank clearing, for example. And that means that even the method of payments, I think, will likely be digital and could well be a central bank digital currency in the future. Then the third question is the management of monetary policy. And this is a long debate. John Maynard Keynes wrote brilliantly about it in the 1920s and the 1930s. Should a currency, whether digital or physical, be convertible into something else, for example, gold, or into some commodity basket, or should it be what economists call a fiat currency, which is that it is only backed by the policies of the central bank or banks that issue that currency, and its value depends on expectations about those policies. And we've had more than 100 years of debate about that. The advantage of linking a currency to a commodity basket is it can't be issued for political purposes, especially to finance government payments not backed by a flow of tax revenues, for example. So you can't get a hyperinflation in a backed currency. And that's been deemed to be the advantage, that it is a kind of straitjacket and focuses on the real economy, limits the capacity to issue credit. But on the other hand, it proved to be highly disadvantageous in other circumstances. When the world was on a gold standard or a gold exchange standard, if there were long periods in which major gold deposits were not discovered, that gave, on average, a deflationary weight to the world price trends, and that was deemed to have distributional and real economy effects that were not highly desirable, although it also had some desirable effects as well. It also made it harder for central banks to be lenders of last resort in financial panics. And the Great Depression is a very complicated, fascinating, and important subject to understand about central banking and whether the gold standard was a contributor to the persistence of the Great Depression. Well, I don't want us to get into long excursus about monetary theory, except to say that there are several questions on the table right now. First, whose currency? Second, the technology of settlement. And third, the organization of monetary policy. They're all very interesting. I spent many decades studying them, and I think there's no ideal systems here, which is why we continue to have these discussions decade after decade after decade.
Right. Well, getting back to China, I did listen to your presentation in Beijing I think it was at the UN headquarters there, to, I think probably
Group of
international ambassadors, yeah.
Yep.
And probably Chinese officials as well, right? But anyway,
yep.
Yeah, it was very interesting. I mean, you really focused on the Chinese miracle, the transformation of China over a mere 40 years into, from one of the poorest to one of the richest in history, actually, and the transformation of elimination of poverty and so forth. So, I mean, this was a quite interesting presentation. what I really found interesting was your discussion of the idea that the Chinese model would be the proper approach for dealing with the development of Africa, which of course is also very much part of China's role in the Belt and Road. But in particular, you contrasted that directly to the policies of the IMF, which I thought I'd ask you to elaborate on here, because it was a very interesting way of showing the failure of the IMF to bring about real development in Africa or any other part of the developing sector.
I think, to put it very straightforwardly, the rapid economic growth of China, which was by traditional measures around 10% per year growth of the domestic economy, persistently between 1980 and nearly the year 2020. So an increase that was more than 30-fold, if you accumulate, in the size of the Chinese economy, came about by investment. What does investment mean? Investment means building the capital stock of a country. What is a capital stock? A capital stock means the productive assets of an economy. What are those? Well, those are three main categories. First, what we carry in our own bodies and brains, the so-called human capital. That's the education and the skills and the health of the population. The second is the physical infrastructure, which is the roads, the power grid, the fiber optics grid, the water and sewerage systems, and fast rail, highways, all of the networking that the economy depends on. And the third is the business sector, the manufacturing industries, agriculture, and so forth. Well, if you look at China's growth during 1980 to 2020, the rates of investment were extraordinary. The rate of investment means essentially the share of the national income that is invested each year in new capital. And in the United States, the gross investment rate, which means the amount of investment that we undertake, not recognizing that some of it's just offsetting depreciation, the gross investment is something on the order of 15 to 20% of the national income. But in China, it was typically 40 to 50% of the national income. So a supercharged investment rate. Before our eyes, China built thousands of kilometers of fast rail, thousands of kilometers of a highway system, thousands of kilometers of an electricity distribution system, and on and on and on. Really impressive. And that's what powered China. That plus the huge investments in education and skills. So China started without much infrastructure at all, and it started with very poor education levels by the late 1970s, because China had had so much turmoil over the preceding 150 years. But then China finally, starting in 1978, said, okay, we're going for it. Deng Xiaoping came to power. He was perhaps modern history's single most successful economic reformer. He pointed China in the right direction, said, go for growth, open the economy, make a market economy, make a mixed economy, build infrastructure, invest in the people. And lo and behold, that extraordinarily high investment rate led to 40 years of rapid growth. Now, the problem when it comes to the IMF is that the IMF does not have that vision in mind. The IMF's vision to a finance minister of a poor country is, don't bother us with your problems. Don't get into excessive debt. Don't get into a financial crisis, and don't bother us about your poverty. Thank you very much. So nobody thinks very hard about the way for these countries to get out of poverty, but the way is just like China did, which is massive investments. And then comes the question how to finance those investments. China partly borrowed in the early years, but also had a massively high saving rate internally. So as the income was rising, China wasn't consuming it in a lot of household consumer spending. Chinese households were saving a lot of their rising income. Chinese businesses were reinvesting a lot of their profits. The government wasn't running huge deficits on its current transactions and so forth. All of this meant a very high saving rate that could be turned into a high investment rate. Now, Africa right now has a very, very low saving rate because people are impoverished. They can't save more. They have to survive. So they need some help with the financing right now by essentially some international financing, say from the African Development Bank or from the Belt and Road program, in which China can provide some of the financing to build that infrastructure in Africa. But that's the advice that Africa should be getting. Invest strongly, invest heavily, borrow where you need to borrow, get your kids in school, electrify the economy, build the roads, build the fast rail, and so forth. And I think China can help to give some very good advice in that direction.
The China model. Right.
Yeah, China shows, you can have 40 years of supercharged growth, and that's what Africa needs.
40 years. Yeah, I agree. You also spoke at Chufu, the birthplace of Confucius, which now is a shrine and a museum, I believe, right? A major site.
Well, that temple, the Confucian temple, has been there for more than 2,000 years. And each emperor has come and added a stone, added an inscription, added calligraphy, because Confucius has been an intellectual hero and guidepost for China basically for 2,500 years. So it's really impressive to be there at a Confucius birthday party, which I was, because this goes back essentially 2,500 years, and it's a large complex of buildings because emperor after emperor added their own building to it. So you really get the feel of China's very long, remarkable history.
Right. And you focus there on the idea that we find our common humanity by studying the great philosophers and thinkers of every culture. In particular, you looked at Confucius and Buddha and Aristotle. I think I would differ with you on Aristotle and would have focused on Plato rather than Aristotle. But that's a discussion for another time. But in any case, this idea of looking at the great cultures and the history, the best moments of the great cultures, is the exact opposite of so-called geopolitics, which is what guides the Western leaders today, deriving from ideologues like Alfred Mackinder and other ideologues of the British Empire. So, which their view is that the only way to advance is by putting down the other guy, the opposite of the interest of the other, and rather, and this, of course, leads to the sanctions policy. You didn't mention the sanctions when you talked about the theft of reserves, but even the sanctions policy, as I understand it, is based on the fact that people have to use the dollar in trade, and that therefore they think they have a right to impose these sanctions on countries. But in any case, China, of course, is not looking to suppress anybody else, and the massive sanctions against China and Russia and many other countries indicates a failure of thinking in terms of the great cultures and what can be done with a culture for the future. So how do we restore that looking to the great minds of antiquity in the West?
I think that there are two philosophical points that we really need to pay attention to that are quite fascinating, quite deep. One is the question of human nature, and the philosophers that I refer to, and I like Aristotle personally, but also I like the fact that Aristotle, Buddha, and Confucius allow us to talk about the ABCs of philosophy. So it's getting back to the core ABCs. And what the ABCs, Aristotle, Buddha, and Confucius, had in mind about human nature is that it is potentially good, meaning that with proper cultivation, proper education, proper mentoring, living in a decent community, people can learn to be harmonious. People can learn to be fair, trustworthy. People can learn reciprocity. So this is sometimes called virtue ethics, the idea that people can be decent, pretty good. Now, there's another philosophical strain which is deeply pessimistic. Augustine in Christian history is the exemplar of that. Man is fallen, and so man is a sinner, and there's no way out except perhaps by God's grace. But the sinfulness can't be washed away, and pessimists in history have believed that. And another pessimist like that had a huge influences my second dimension, which is how people behave or how states interact. And Hobbes, in a way, is a follower of Augustine. Hobbes, of course, wrote in the 1600s, whereas Augustine was more than a millennium earlier than that. But Hobbes was the quintessential British philosopher who said people are rapacious, they are greedy, they are pushy, they are violent, and the best you can hope for is that someone controls them from killing each other. So he called for a very tight centralized state for that purpose. But basically the Hobbesian idea is that you can't do anything in a state of nature, but defend yourself from being killed by someone else. And strangely enough, while British thinkers accepted that there would be a national government that would stop people from killing each other inside Britain, they took the view that internationally, it is a Hobbesian war of all against all, that just countries fight with each other. And this is in the current thinking of international relations known as the realist school. And our leading realist thinker in the United States is John Mearsheimer at University of Chicago. He's a wonderful person and a tremendous gentleman and a great scholar. But he thinks that countries are, and especially great powers, are inevitably at each other's throats. And unfortunately, there's a lot of empirical evidence that this is often the case. But John Mearsheimer says the implication of this is that the world is tragic. His most famous book is called The Tragedy of Great Power Politics, because he says conflict is just about inevitable between major powers because nobody trusts each other. You can't trust each other. It's a war of all against all. It's eat or be eaten, kill or be killed. And so, yes, life's tragic. And I debate him. Again, we're friends and I admire him a lot. I want to be clear. But I say, John, we can't accept tragedy as our fate. We have to do better than that. And so I go back to the philosophers, and the philosophers taught, you can have harmony. That was Confucius's main message, which is it's possible actually to be decent. It's possible to observe what was famous for Confucius and in similar terms for us in the Western culture as the golden rule. Do not do to others what you would not have them do to you. If you're a Hobbesian, you say, there goes Sachs moralizing, but that's not how the world is. I'm going to do what I can to the others because otherwise they're going to do something terrible to me and I'm going to get there first. And I say no.
Because that's human nature. That's what they are.
Because that's the deep human nature. That's inevitable.
Yeah, right.
But I don't believe it. It's certainly not the case that we're always at war against each other. We can be better than that. But by the way, China absolutely has a different history and a different mindset. And this is also a fascinating point. It's not just Confucius versus Hobbes. It's actually history. 2,000 years of statecraft. What have we learned? Well, in China, for most of the 2,000 years, there was a centralized state. This is very important. For most of the 2,000 years, there was the Han dynasty, or the Tang dynasty, or the Song dynasty, or the Yuan dynasty, or the Ming dynasty, or the Qing dynasty, or today the People's Republic of China. And for most of that 2,000 years, there was one country. And while there were rebellions and there were a lot of invasions from the north, mainly from the nomadic peoples in the dryland, grassland, steppe regions, there was one country, big population. Now in Europe, after 476 AD, when the Roman Empire fell in the West, there never again was one dominant power of Western Europe. So there was war nonstop. Think of Britain and France, for example. How many years were they at war during the past 1,000 years? An incredible amount across the channel. Now compare that with China and Japan. How many years were China and Japan at war between, you could take it back before 1000 AD, but say from 1000 AD to 1890? The answer is 2 years. I think it's 1274 and 1281, if I remember correctly. And there was actually one incursion a third year. Now, two of those were when the Mongols ruled China and they tried to invade Japan and failed on two occasions. Once was when a shogun, a military commander of Japan, ridiculously tried to invade China and was terribly defeated in the Korean Peninsula. But my point is not that. My point is they didn't fight for 1,000 years. Barely a skirmish. By the way, when Japan industrialized and was the first industrializing nation, Japan followed the realist approach, sadly. Japan said, okay, now we're part of the imperial club. Now we're going to go invade China. And the Chinese diplomat said, what are you doing? We're Asians. And Japan said, no, now we're part of the Western club. This was back in the 1890s. So Japan really behaved badly by becoming an imperialist power for some period, but China never did in that way. And if we understand the different philosophical roots, this is crucial. If we understand the different experience of Europe and China, we can come to appreciate that our mindset in the West that, well, it's war all the time, so China's an enemy, so we better go at it, is nothing the way that China thinks. And when I said to John Mearsheimer, again, I want to stress, a friend and and a brilliant scholar, when I said all this warmongering against China is going to create a self-fulfilling prophecy of war, he said, yes. I said, John, self-fulfilling, we don't need to have that war. He said, yes, but that's how it is. And yeah. I said, no, we don't need to have it that way. We can do better than that. So that's the debate.
Helga issued what she calls the 10 principles for an architecture of security and development for the world as a whole. And most of them are sort of self-evident. You need education, you need cultural training, you need health, so forth. But the 10th principle is exactly what you just brought up, that the nature of man is good. And this is the one that's most difficult for people to accept or understand. But it's the fundamental one. It's really the issue, as I think you correctly just located. This is what distinguishes the idea of being committed to global development rather than global war. And of course, as you said, also the Confucian concept of harmony and the concentration on education is really the center of the Chinese development of their own country over the last 40 years. And what's now being taken out to the rest of the world through the Belt and Road. And as you know, we just had the Belt and Road third Belt and Road Forum in Beijing with 150 countries represented, which certainly demonstrates that they've failed miserably in the isolation of China in the world, and that the idea that they could get countries to decouple from China has just forced most countries to say, you're crazy. This is where development is rather than war and sanctions. And in fact, the headline of our EIR this week is going to be on the fact that Xi Jinping offered a $100 billion new investments through the Belt and Road at the same time that Mr. Biden was offering a $100 billion investment in wars, naming specifically Russia, meaning Ukraine, Israel, the genocide being carried out against the Palestinians, and China. They included Taiwan as one of the places where this $100 billion. So it's pretty clear that they're talking about a global war. And the only question is, how can this madness be stopped and reversed?
Well, it is so unacceptable American foreign policy. And what I hope people are coming to understand is that the arrogance and the militarization of the United States that has been demonstrated time and again now over the past 30 years is not bringing security to the U.S. It has busted the budget. We've spent trillions of dollars on these horrible wars that have accomplished nothing except violence and destruction and rising debt. And they're not making America safer at all. There are more and more wars that are a reflection of this arrogance, because the arrogance has meant that American policymakers have thought, we can do what we want and we don't have to talk with anybody about it. We don't need diplomacy. We just need our military. And the military can't solve political problems. And we're finding out again and again that the military approach doesn't work to solve the deeper problems of humanity, and can't settle political issues. For that, you need politics. You need diplomacy, and I mean politics in the positive sense of getting together to work out arrangements for people to live peacefully together. So I think the failures of American foreign policy are on full display. Also, the ignorance of it, because I would cite our National Security Advisor's statement, Jake Sullivan, about a week before the violence blew up in Israel and Gaza with the Hamas attack and now the bombing of Gaza. Jake Sullivan said, the Middle East is the quietest that it's been in 2 decades. And it shows they don't know anything except what their own imagination is, and they don't understand what's happening around the world. What's happening around the world is that people want a different approach. They want development. They want social justice. They want the chance for decent lives. They don't want the militarized approach. Mike, we're going to have to go. Great to speak with you, and I have a call starting right now. What happened to Western values? Because it's a very interesting and important and strange story in a way, and it's worth reflecting on. The values that we heard about both Buddhist and Confucian thought clearly find some resonance in Christian thought, especially in gospel teachings of Jesus, and also in Greek thought, because if you look at Aristotle's philosophy, as was seen, you would find some connections that are quite important, actually, and I want to draw them out. But then Western philosophy took an odd turn, or Western thinking took an odd turn, and it's important to understand that change of values that took place starting around 1500 to today, because there really was a change of the Western philosophical approach and a divergence that is, I think, quite harmful in many ways. So if you look at Aristotle, Buddha, and Confucius, if I might, just very briefly, they're all in deep ways, not the same ways, but deep ways, variants of what can be called virtue ethics. The idea of virtue ethics is that human beings have the potential to do good, not the inevitability of doing good, and that virtues need to be cultivated to bring out the best in human beings. And this is a common idea of Aristotle, Buddha, and Confucius in the teachings. In Buddha's Eightfold Noble Path, there is the idea of the right view, the right action, the right speech, the right livelihood, and so on, as ways to cultivate the underlying virtues. Aristotle was very, very clear that happiness depends on virtue, but virtue must be cultivated. It cannot be taken for granted. And the main virtues in the Greek thought were virtues of what's called practical wisdom, or phronesis, which was the ability to choose the good over the enticing; temperance, which is moderation, which is a common virtue across all of these philosophies; bravery, which means the ability to defend the good; and justice, the ability to discern the right allocation for each person. And so those became the cardinal virtues in Western thought. But what was key for Aristotle was the idea that being virtuous is a potential of human beings, not an inevitability, because we are all bound by our bodily temptations, by our animal instincts, but also by our reason. So in Western Greek thought, reason was the predominant notion. This is not the same as in Eastern thought, but it comes to some similar points. And Aristotle said one must develop the habits of virtue. In fact, virtue or ethics comes from the word habit in Greek, that you practice, just as we heard, that you become altruistic by practicing altruistic acts. And Aristotle believed in mentorship, in education, in practice, in life experience as being vital. So here is a common basis that merges East and West virtue traditions at a quite deep level. And Christian thought, especially the teachings of Jesus himself as in the Gospels, are not the same basis. It's not exactly virtue ethics, but it is, of course, the virtues that are proposed, and especially also the Confucian golden rule is also Jesus's golden rule, although Jesus states it positively: do to others what you would have them do to you, and love thy neighbor as you love yourself. And that led in the early centuries of Christianity to a tremendous institutional focus of the bishops and the monasteries to care for the poor. And that was a real point, because the Christian communities, the emperors took care of their business and the bishops took care of the poor in a division of responsibility that started around the 4th century AD in the West. Skipping ahead 1,000 years, philosophy changed starting around 1500 in a rather deep way. And while Aristotle taught, for example, that politics is a field of ethics, and Aristotle's book, The Politics, which is the first book of Western political thought, no, let me say it's the first book of Western political science is the better way to say it, because Plato had written the Republic a generation earlier. But it's the first book of political science. It is paired with his ethics, Nicomachean Ethics, as two joined volumes, because for Aristotle, ethics and politics were the same. Of course, in 1514, I think it is, Machiavelli wrote a very different political science. He wrote a handbook for the prince, which was about how to maintain power. And political science in the West began to be the science of maintaining or managing power, not the science of producing the good. And in fact, Machiavelli was teaching the prince. He was actually making a job application back to the Medicis because he had been dismissed from the Medicis, wanting a job back that he was advising the Medicis how to hold power in Florence. Later in the next century, one of the most influential texts in Western cultural history was written by Thomas Hobbes, the Leviathan. And this was written in 1640 as Western science was taking shape. And Hobbes wanted a scientific theory of human beings, but modeled as individual atoms that collide with each other. Because for Hobbes, there was no longer a cultivation of virtue, but rather each individual with insatiable desires. So Hobbes's model of human nature is that it is simply unbounded desire. It can't be taught to moderate desire. It can't be cultivated for virtue. It is individualistic and it is insatiable. And so Hobbes said, unless there is an overarching power, people will kill each other. And so we need a Leviathan, he said, to stop human nature from committing non-stop violence. It was a very pessimistic view of human nature, but notice the main point is no longer was there any idea of developing virtue. That was deemed to be impossible. Instead, one needed institutions to reflect harsh reality. This is the flip of philosophy. It's no longer about cultivating the good.
it is about controlling the bad. Then interestingly and importantly, this was amplified at the beginning of the 18th century, first by a very influential public intellectual, Bernard Mandeville, who wrote an essay in London called The Fable of the Bees. And in The Fable of the Bees, the most aggressive bees win, but they make the hive powerful and great. And if you try to control the avarice or the vice or the aggression of the bees, the hive actually dies. So this was now a philosophy of empire, that power seeking was good because it would make the society powerful and wealthy and able to dominate over the other bees. So it was taking Hobbes and adding another element, one beehive taking dominance over others. And clearly this was a philosophy that appealed to the emerging British Empire. Then came Adam Smith 6 decades later in 1776, and he said, in agreement with Hobbes and in agreement with Mandeville, that human nature is individualistic, tastes are unbounded, desire is a great motivator, but market forces will tame all of that, because market forces will force a kind of competition that will lead to a socially beneficent outcome. The point is, the Anglo-Saxon philosophy broke free of more than 1,800 years of Western tradition. The Western tradition from Aristotle and Christianity was a tradition of the common good, virtue, and care for the poor. With the rise of the British Empire, the philosophy became the benefits of power as a philosophy. And then even the idea that this would lead to, quote, the common good. But there are two more steps that are important to state. The poor became an enemy because now they were a drag on society. So John Locke, one of our most esteemed philosophers, wanted very harsh treatment for the poor so that they would not be burdens on society. And then came Malthus. Thomas Malthus wrote after Adam Smith, one generation later in 1798. And he proposed something even darker, which is that those hives, those different societies, are actually in competition for survival with each other, because there are more people produced than can be supported. And so life is a battle for survival, and trying to help the poor is inevitably to fail, because there will just be more poor people. That was his iron law of population. And that led in the next step. Darwin took that idea brilliantly from a scientific point of view to understand natural selection. But the later 19th century philosophers took that idea as a struggle across nations, and that now nations or peoples or races were in the struggle for survival. And this became known as social Darwinism. And the idea was, not only should there be no beneficence, if you help your own poor, you will weaken your society compared to others. And indeed, you're in a struggle for survival. And this gave rise to the worst crimes of history. because Nazism actually as a philosophy, which it was based on social Darwinist pseudoscience. And this idea, the German people will survive or the Slavic people will survive. And so this is a war even to extermination. Now, this kind of idea led to the worst cruelties, but we are still in a mindset in the Western world where it is competition and struggle that is the absolute underpinning of society. When I studied economics, I was taught about perfect competition. I was never taught even 1 minute about perfect cooperation. The idea doesn't even exist in economics. It's not even developed in one paper that I know of, because the idea of cooperation as a norm doesn't exist. It happened, this notion of letting greed motivate action perhaps did generate the spirit of innovation to some extent. But the way that it was championed and taught, of course, led to the worst excesses. So the world became rich, and those who were rich became devoid of benevolence and compassion. And a terrible writer in the United States who became quite popular, Ayn Rand, a kind of popular philosopher among young people and among many politicians, wrote a famous essay about the virtues of selfishness. So selfishness became the virtue, actually. That's the literal title of an essay. It's unbelievable. And she is championed by many still. These novels are unbearable to read, but they are part of our philosophy. So I went on too long, I know, because the sign told me to stop 5 minutes ago. But so that's not very benevolent of me. But let me say the following. I believe we've had a deviation from the right path in Western civilization. There are roots of Western culture that we can really use to find a path of virtue and politics that is ethical. But the Anglo-Saxon version deeply lost this tradition. And there are many fascinating reasons for this, but it was mainly the rise of power of the British Empire, which was in many ways an extremely nasty empire. And the United States learned everything it knows from the British Empire because it aims to be the continuation of the British Empire after World War II. And this is what needs to end, a world that can return to the common ethical principles of virtue. Now, let me just conclude by saying I am hopeful that this can actually happen. And I think you at the table need to help lead that. And we need to help explain these things. And when President Xi Jinping launched last year the Global Civilizations Initiative, I think that this is actually an important opening that is very positive, because China has said we should go back to our roots of culture to find a way forward, which I very much subscribe to. And the GCI, or Global Civilizations Initiative, is an invitation across civilizational wisdom. And I hosted a meeting in Athens last month, co-hosted,
with the Academy of Athens a Aristotle-Confucius symposium on ancient wisdom for modern challenges that brought together Chinese and Western philosophers. We didn't have Buddha properly at the table except one very distinguished Buddhist thinker from Cambodia, but we need more of that. At the end of this meeting, we agreed that we would have a second symposium. This time, I hope it is the Aristotle Buddha Confucius Symposium in Shufu, in Shandong province in July. I hope we could participate together in that. We will be back for that. Many philosophers are interested in that. I will be in Shufu in next month for the Nishan Forum, which is also a philosophical forum, but the Shandong government has asked to host the follow-up meeting of the Aristotle Buddha Confucius Symposium. And I believe that this idea of East and West deep philosophical traditions, finding the deep humanity that is common across them, is extremely important and powerful and can really contribute to an understanding which right now doesn't exist. And I think the failings of this understanding are overwhelmingly on the Western side, if I may say so, because we are steeped in a philosophy of competition and even war. And this mindset is taken as given, but it is actually a recent phenomenon. It is an imperial phenomenon, and it needs to be put aside. So I believe that this actually can be done. Can I have 2 more minutes? Because I want to talk about net zero by 2050. And first to say how much I admire what Dr. Shaw proposed, and is the book in English also, or in Chinese?
English,
Okay, we're going to have to get me an English translation somehow, if we can. But I'm very eager also to read your forthcoming paper. Let me add a couple of things that I think are central, but I think they're already exactly in your climate club idea. It is not possible to reach net zero one country at a time, least of all for an island. We need an interconnected energy system, region by region, because if you are tapping renewable energy, it's intermittent. So it's sunny here or windy here. This needs interconnection. And East Asia should be interconnected in a common grid. There is a mainland China program called GuideCo, Cooperation Organization, that is the China State Grid engineers who are doing analytical work on interconnecting regional grids for Africa, for South America, for North America, for Europe, and for Asia. This is very important work. Taiwan should be connected to the mainland in a power grid, and the mainland should be connected with Mongolia, and it should be connected with the ASEAN countries, and with submarine system. It would be region, the economic powerhouse of the world.
rather than a battleground, because this region has everything if it works together, and it could lose everything if it views the region as a battleground. I think everyone in this region can understand this. The only one that does not is my country, actually. But the U.S. needs to be told, let us solve our problems. We know how to discuss. Don't meddle, because you will make a mess. This is actually the truth. This is true about Japan. It's true of zero carbon energy and all the cooperation that would the regional cooperation, the regional structure, and pose and probably roadmaps that show the physical interconnectedness, what technologies, where, as I've been saying, opposite of a plan. It's 80% fossil fuel. What plan is that? Nothing. Please, don't encourage them. So, show fantastic work. Sonia and I were just in Beijing with them a couple of days ago. We'll come back for a meeting that they're hosting on September 26th for a worldwide meeting on energy interconnections. I think that this is really absolutely at the core. So I agree with everything that you said, and I think that it's absolutely the way forward. And in that polycentric world, there's a concept which I find very useful. It's a concept adopted by the European Union, but a concept that actually started with the Roman Catholic Church, and that is the concept of subsidiarity, which is that we need governance at all levels. So we need global governance, regional governance, national governance, local governance. You put each problem at the lowest level possible, closest to the people, where it can be solved, but not below the level at which it can be solved. So the power grid cannot be solved at the national level. It must be solved at the regional level. The targets for decarbonization must be solved at the global level, and so forth. And the idea of subsidiarity is that we have this multiple levels. We have global governance. We have a global government that can do certain things and not other things. We have regional government. We have national government. We have local